Beda is away today. She'll be back tomorrow. She's having a long weekend. Yeah, I'm suitably jealous, I must say. It's time now for what we call the Roundup Wrap, and that's a weekly segment that we do where we speak to political analyst and commentator Mighti Jamie, and he unpacks some of the major stories that have been making headlines in the week that was across the continent and beyond, and we'll also cast an eye on the week ahead. Let's say good morning to Mighti Jamie. How you doing, my brother? I hope you've had a good long weekend so far.
Morning, Peter. Morning to the listeners and the viewers. Yes, I did have a good weekend, but I've got a 10-kilometer run a little bit later today. It's a church run. About 10 a.m. I should be out on the road.
Wow. How long does it take you to do 10Ks now?
We'll find out. I haven't done a lot of running in the last 3 weeks.
Oh, dear. Okay.
I'll report back to you next week.
Well, one story that really has been giving the government of Zambia the runaround a little bit has been the repatriation of former President Lungu's body, remains back to Zambia. The family at odds with the government, and a special note that was left, I believe, by the former president saying that President Hakainde Hichilema should be nowhere near his body after his passing. We've seen this story before, haven't we, in Zimbabwe?
We did see this story in Zimbabwe with Mugabe and Mnangagwa, and because of the way that Mnangagwa ascended into power and the relationship that soured between him and Mugabe, there was a lot of controversy and tension around the burial of Mugabe and where Mugabe would be buried. And it seems as if this is a similar thing that is playing out here. We know that Edgar Lungu and the current president had a lot of differences in the transition, but also in the period prior. There was a lot of rivalry that I think at some point turned into enmity, and this is what has caused this conundrum, so to speak, because even in past instances, Zambian presidents where they've expressed that they don't want to necessarily be buried with the other presidents, even Edgar Lungu at some point was prevailing that they should be buried with the other presidents and to continue the history. But it looks as if in his last days, he was not interested in that spirit of unity, unanimity, and was more interested, in settling this particular score. And it remains to be seen whether or not this funeral will go as his wishes, or whether the president, the sitting president Hichilema, will be able to also impose some of his will on that particular situation. But it is something that has been quite, dramatic and tense in terms of just those particular relationships. Of course, another conversation happening concurrently is the fact that the former Zambian president needed treatment in South Africa as opposed to in his home nation, and their discussions around the failures of African leaders to provide services, public services, at a level of quality that they can be able to use them. But the current controversy is around the final resting place of the former president of Zambia, Peter. It's quite mind-boggling set of instances here, because one wonders, even from Hichilema's perspective, how he would want his own funeral to be handled in a situation where the same dynamics play out, because everybody is able to be more magnanimous when it doesn't affect them. But if there are tensions, perhaps this whole tradition of burying the leaders in the same resting places is something that shouldn't actually be continued. I'm not sure whether the Europeans or the Americans do something similar, but I think maybe there's even need for a conversation about the necessity of this, because it does lead to these inevitable tensions.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers to this story, but I guess in the end, this must be really embarrassing for President Hichilema.
Yeah, it definitely is embarrassing. It definitely is something that is not in keeping with how he wants to be viewed in his own, narrative, or the perspective which exists in the international community about him. This looks, in ways that there was a pettiness to the relationship. And we've seen members of now the opposition complaining about the treatment of Edgar Lungu and how he was being ostracized and sidelined, and how they were making particular moves to prevent him from running again or even being a political player. And these type of things definitely, when they happen in this manner, do have the effect of being embarrassing, particularly to your own constituency, the citizens of your country. I think this is one of the big discussions in Zambia, and will continue to be.
Let's go to West Africa now. President Bola Tinubu has issued a posthumous pardon to the Ogoni Nine, including Ken Saro-Wiwa, on the eve of Nigeria's Democracy Day. But several environmental and human rights groups have criticized it as symbolic and insufficient.
Yeah, Peter, this story traces back to, the days of General Sani Abacha, and it traces back to some of the issues around the exploitation of the oil reserves in Nigeria and how certain people are feeling particularly about the exploitations about those particular reserves. So right now, if you go to this particular state, Peter, the levels of soot, the levels of pollution are such that it's gotten really bad, and you can actually put a white sheet outside and it will actually have soot at the end of the day on it. And these things have been raised by people in the Delta region. They've been raised countless times. So I think one of the big criticisms that is now existing is that when the people were protesting, Ken Saro-Wiwa and others, they were protesting about the behavior of Shell. They were protesting about the environmental degradation. Of course, Abacha responded in that very draconian manner. But on the environmental level, the conversation now is, well, the pollution is continuing. This particular, gesture doesn't deal with the underlying root issue that they were protesting against. But secondly, other people are actually saying that they need to see reparations, they need to see a truth and reconciliation type of process, and they actually need to see remediation in the Niger Delta, dealing with some of the issues that the people are raising there about feeling economically excluded, not getting all of the benefits. And this also links back to how the people in the Biafra region also were expressing their concerns. So it's a real challenge for the current president, in that while he's trying to get support from this gesture and try to, close these wounds, so to speak, people on the ground are saying that he's not done enough, not gone far enough, and the issues are still continuing in the Delta region.
The fourth China-Africa Economic and Trade Expo, with over $11 billion worth of deals and participation from 14 African countries, signifying a significant uptick in trade engagement. What does this surge in signed projects and investments tell us about the current trajectory of China-Africa relations?
Well, this is all happening at a very interesting time, Peter, if you think about this China-Africa relationship, because one, we have the global dynamic now where Trump is trying to regain some footprint in Africa and to contest with China for rare earth minerals, some of which come from the DRC. We've seen them trying to sign a deal between Rwanda and the DRC. So when you have a country like Rwanda participating in this process, it actually just raises an asterisk or a star, so to speak, in terms of what's happening here, because we have to be cognizant that now it seems that there are going to be dynamics to this relationship which affect the geopolitics. Even if you think about Angola, it was one of the big sites of contestation in the Cold War. So when you begin to see DRC, Rwanda, and Angola, in the context of 2025 under this Trump 2.0, so to speak, that's one factor. Now, looking at the China side of the equation, one of the things that is clear is that China has become the dominant player in Africa. It has become the dominant player in terms of trade. It has become the dominant player in terms of infrastructure development. It has become the dominant player in terms of lending as well to African nations. And in that conversation around its dominance, there is then the conversation around, is that dominance to the benefit of the everyday African, or is it to the benefit of the elites, the dictatorship, and the bureaucrats, which are present in several African nations? Because China, unlike the World Bank and the IMF, does not make conditions in terms of its lending. It doesn't require you to fit any type of readjustment program, but also it doesn't also insist on any human rights program. So I think while there is credence to the economic argument that some of these readjustment programs, such as the one we saw in Zimbabwe under ESAP, was not successful, but the human rights issues are such that China is willing to do deals with dictatorships, with people who are violating people's freedom of expression, political rights, etc. And that then leads the question for the everyday African to ask and say, are we actually going to benefit from this continuing strengthening of ties? Then at the economic level, there's also the conversation about, are we not being infantilized by the continued dependence on China? Because how do we develop textiles? How do you develop furniture? How do we develop all of these type of manufacturing industries while we continue to import large volumes of these products from China? At some point, I was surprised that the spoons in my house, candles that I bought from the shops here in South Africa, were being manufactured in China. And I couldn't understand why I would need to get a spoon from China and a candle, Peter, from China. And I think as we have this conversation about this strengthening of ties and how, we're trying to reset the geopolitical dynamics, we still need to ask ourselves as Africans, what is the full benefit that we're getting? But we are seeing this continuing deepening of the economic relationship, and China is definitely in the strongest position that they've ever been in Africa, although Trump is trying to renegotiate and to find a footprint as well, Peter.
So, the Middle East, my goodness, things are intensifying there. Iran and Israel exchanging fresh attacks and warning both sides to show some restraint, warnings coming from the US. And this is a difficult one for Donald Trump. He seems to have walked back a little bit in terms of encouraging or allowing Israel to do what it feels it must do in Iran. But the stakes are quite high, and whilst it's between Israel and Iran, this could spread, right?
Yes, it could spread, Peter, because the tensions that are happening in this particular region affect a variety of other countries. You look at Syria, you look at Lebanon, you look at Iraq, you look at Saudi Arabia. All of these countries are interconnected. So when there's a dispute between Israel and Iran, the geopolitical dynamics are such that you could easily get escalation further. But this is an escalation upon an escalation, because part of the discussions we've been having about the confrontations between Israel and Hamas and in Gaza is that there's that thread and that connection between all of these entities and the Iranians, and some of the allegations that the Israelis have been making from day one, October 7, of this particular iteration of this particular conflict, is that Iran has been involved. So it looks as if we had an escalation now upon an escalation. At some point, we were seeing, the rebel groups in Yemen participating in the conflict, but that was not particularly an escalation which we would have considered to be at the level of Iran, because Iran is one of the regional power brokers in the Middle East, and in fact has this long-standing rivalry with Saudi Arabia. So as things stand right now, while Donald Trump has tried to shift his rhetoric and he is now prevaricating between the two positions, I think that the genie may be out of the bottle, the cat is out of the bag in this particular respect, because he's already allowed for this particular escalation. It looks like the Americans were aware and they did know about everything that was going on, Peter. And it looks as if because of that knowledge and that almost tacit permission which was given in the hope that it would bring Iran back to the negotiation table, we're now in a very precarious position. It's precarious for the global community because if you recall, in 1973, there was the Arab-Israeli war, and that led to an escalation in the price of oil. That led to various African nations defaulting on their debt because Zambia, for example, was selling copper at a particular price. Once fuel got expensive, they were no longer able to sell it competitively competitively. Then they started defaulting on their payments, and then the Zambian kwacha crashed in the 80s in a catastrophic fashion. And this was as a result and on the backdrop of that. And then the UK went into the Margaret Thatcherite and economic policies almost as a repudiation of some of the decisions made in the 70s as a result of the Arab-Israeli war. So we're in a tricky position, Peter, as a result of all of this.
All right. I mean, we've got to end, but we can't end without talking about June 16 and
Yes.
Youth Day. I do wonder, though, it is about the youth, but the youth of today, many of them have no memory of this. And I wonder what a day like today, whilst it's a youth day, is it something that they embrace and understand its importance?
I think, no, Peter, I think the meaning has been diluted by political actors, by, marketing companies, big corporate, and this focus just on calling it Youth Day. It was a protest against being taught in Afrikaans. It was a protest against the miseducation. It was a protest against the 1953 Bantu Education Act. And one of the statistics which still bothers me, Peter, is that the average mark for mathematics last year, the average mark was 36%. 36%
Wow.
was the average mark. And that is an indication that what Verwoerd intended with the Bantu Education Act is still happening, because he said that black people should not learn mathematics, and they are still not being taught mathematics, even though the dispensation has changed. So I do think it's lost a lot of meaning. I think the politicians have diluted it, they've captured it. And I think also the youth nowadays, without being taught robust history, they have lost an appreciation of that. They don't even show Sarafina on all of the TV stations around about this time. There was a time when SAPC used to do it religiously, but not so much. And I think a lot of people, especially in this younger demographic, have lost that meaning, which is regrettable because, as I've said, the average maths mark is 36%, and a lot of work still needs to be done, Peter. 430 schools are not teaching mathematics. It's a crisis. I think it's 430, 460 schools don't have a maths teacher in the country right now. And that's a tragedy in and of itself. But hopefully, some of the young people can continue to appreciate what it was about and continue the activism. Even Fees Must Fall is having a 10-year anniversary now. So if we're thinking about the 10-year anniversary of Fees Must Fall, thinking about the crisis of teachers and teaching in the South African schools, we can see that the spirit of the protest in 1976 has not fully been respected by the politicians and even by corporate South Africa, Peter.
All right. Mighty Jamie, we're going to have to leave it there. Good luck with your run. And we hope that you will not be out of breath by next week.
Thank you. I'll try to pace myself, Peter. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. That's Mighty Jamie, one of our regular commentators. We speak to him every Monday as he unpacks the big stories of the week that was. It's time now for your business news as we say good morning to Buntle Hedbush.